Thanks everybody for being here. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you so much, David and Pace, for inviting us to present today, and also for working on this policy brief, which is being released right now. And it's really great to see all of you and share this information with you. So this policy brief got started because several of us that were wandering the hallways at Stanford started to realize that we weren't the only people working in school district university partnerships that were focused on English learners. We started getting wind of other partnerships that were happening that also involved Stanford in one way or another. And we realized that there were 3 of these partnerships that were happening at Stanford in the last few years and at other universities like UC Santa Cruz. And so we decided to, Sean Reardon, who is the PI of one of these projects, decided to apply for some funding from the WT Grant Foundation to try to get us together for annual conferences to talk about what we were finding and the questions that were most pressing across these different partnerships. And we started to do that, and in doing that, we realized that we were really uncovering a lot of really valuable information that made sense to share outside of just the school districts that were taking part in these partnerships. And we talked with David at Pace and decided to write this report on synthesizing the findings. I was saying to David this morning that it's a little bit of a challenge to synthesize the findings because these are 3 different 4-year research projects. So there are a lot of different research findings that have come out of this, a lot of different studies. So you'll see that there's a real density of information in the policy brief and also in this presentation, and I won't be able to go into immense detail, but hopefully we'll be able to go into more detail during the question and answer period afterwards. So I am just one of a whole bunch of authors of this policy brief. Sean Reardon and Kenji Hakuda at Stanford, Karen Thompson at OSU, Peggy Estrada at UC Santa Cruz, who's going to come up for the question and answer to join me later, Kathy Hayes, Hilda Maldonado, and Susan Tanberg at LAUSD, and Claude Goldenberg also at Stanford. So this was a true group effort, and I definitely want to acknowledge all of them. Well, we think that this is a moment of immense opportunity in terms of the education of English learners in the state. We have the Common Core, we have the new ELD standards, and we have new assessments that are coming in place to support those new standards. Those are really fundamentally altering the kinds of content that English learners are going to be exposed to. In addition, we have the local control funding formula, which is changing funding, particularly with regard to the education of English learners. And finally, on the ballot in November 2016 is the California Multilingual Education Act, which is creating more space for districts to expand bilingual and dual immersion programs. So all these things are joining forces to create some real opportunity as we think about policies and programs to support California's English learners. So let me tell you a little bit about the 3 partnerships that this policy brief reports the findings coming out of. But first I want to say that all of us that have been involved in these partnerships are really excited about partnerships, research practice partnerships. And this is something that's really gaining momentum right now. The federal government is really incentivizing these as well. And we're really excited about them because of the kind of bridge that they create, which is what PACE also does, the bridge between research and policy. And on the one hand, when you're in a research practice partnership, the research that you're conducting can really directly inform practitioners and policymakers because you're in direct communication with them, you're working together, they're getting the results as they're coming out and able to really put them into practice. The flip side of this is that these partnerships really help researchers because they let us know what are the questions that are most urgent for policymakers and for practitioners. How do we understand these findings or understand this data? So it really enriches our experience in conducting research as well. So we're really excited about these partnerships. So the three partnerships are these ones. The first is a partnership between LA Unified, UC Santa Cruz, where Peggy Estrada is the PI of that project, SRI International, and Stanford. And the authors that are part of this are Peggy, Claude, Ilda, Susan, and Kathy. And this was a project that really was focused a lot on looking at the effects of reclassification of English learners and English learners' access to content in school. The second partnership, and that's an IES-funded project, that first one. The second one is an S.H. Cole Foundation-funded project. It's called the ELL Leadership Network. And it brings together 7 small and medium-sized districts in California, so very different from the LA project. Brings them together with Stanford. Kenji Hakuda is the PI on that, and working very closely with him is Karen Thompson, who's at OSU. And they're really working on capacity building and knowledge sharing across districts. So one of the really cool things that they do is they have districts actually visiting each other to learn from each other what policies and programs they have on the ground running for their English learners. And the final partnership is the one that I was involved with. Sean Reardon is the PI on that. And the school district is a large urban school district that has requested to be anonymous. And this project, again, an IES-funded project, focused on looking at the relative effectiveness of different linguistic instructional programs for English learners. So this district has an early exit bilingual program, a maintenance bilingual program, a dual immersion program, and an English immersion program. So a lot of the results you see about that are looking at programs are going to be coming from that district. So those are the 3 partnerships. And while it's true that these partnerships focused on different questions, it's also true that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that as we were coming together for these meetings, we were finding a lot of complementarity, a lot of ways in which we were seeing patterns that spoke to us that the kinds of research findings we were seeing extended beyond a single district and were really larger phenomena that were in place in large districts and small districts, et cetera. We also found moments where there was not complementarity, where we were really finding different things in different districts, and we thought that was really interesting too. So I'll highlight both of those things as I go through. And I'm going to spend some time going over the research findings, which we organized in this policy brief into 5 key areas. And then afterwards, we'll talk about the policy implications of these different areas of research findings. And at the end, as I said, we'll have time for questions and answers. So these are the 5 areas of research findings. The first has to do with the diversity of English learners, their experiences and outcomes. The second has to do with English learners' access to core content in school. The third has to do with reclassification out of EL status. The fourth has to do with bilingual and dual immersion programs. And the final one has to do with teacher preparation for EL instruction. So I'll go through each one. First, the diversity of EL students. So there's increasing awareness of the diversity within the English learner population. And there's multiple axes of this diversity. For instance, we know that newcomer students have very different educational needs than long-term English learners. There's differences in the generational status of students, first generation versus second and third generation English learner students, current and former English learners, those who reclassify quickly versus those who are reclassifying more slowly. And obviously, there's an immense amount of variation in terms of the linguistic, national, and ethnic background of our English learners in California. But I want to focus a little bit on the case of academic performance, the diversity in academic performance of English learners. So there's a widely held belief that English learners tend to be low-performing students, but the truth is actually much more complex, as I'm sure a lot of you in this room know. Students who come into the districts as English learners in kindergarten, but who reclassify out of EL status relatively early on, so second, third, or fourth grade, these students, when you look at their academic performance, they're actually outperforming English-only students in general. Not only that, but even students, long-term English learners, even students who have not reclassified after 5th grade, even some of them are relatively high-performing students. So this is an area of diversity that we think hasn't gotten enough attention, and we haven't thought enough about the implications of that for programming for students. One big elephant in the room when it comes to the diversity of English learners' academic achievement is students' linguistic and national origin background. So in one of the districts, we saw, and this is reflected in other districts and across the country, we saw very large achievement gaps between Chinese origin English learner students and Latino English learner students. Oftentimes this difference is either people try to push it under the rug and just ignore it, or in other cases we try to assign responsibility either to individual students or to their families or communities. And we find this problematic, and we think that we need to really start thinking about our services and treatments of our Latino students in general, and think about ways in which we may be falling short in terms of our services for Latino English learner students. I also want to talk about the academic language skills in students' first language. So one of the interesting things that we found in the research in these partnerships is that students who come into school with relatively strong literacy bases or academic language skill bases in their first language tend to reclassify more quickly, tend to have higher academic achievement, and tend to attain English proficiency more quickly. And this is something that we haven't thought that much about, and we oftentimes don't have a way of measuring students' incoming literacy base and academic skills base in their home language. So that's another axis of diversity that we think is important to think about. And finally, dual classified students. And by dual classified students, I mean students who are both classified as English learners and are classified within an exceptionality category in special education. So there's increasing awareness and concern about this group of students. One of the things that we found is, as I'm sure many of you know, so we have a system in which we're annually assessing students to reclassify them out of English learner status. So what does this do in effect? In effect, it's skimming off the top in general, our highest performing English learners, so that the group of English learners you have as you move up in grade is becoming a group of students with more and more acute language needs in general, on average. So what we found in looking specifically at long-term English learners, and these are results out of the ELL Leadership Network districts, is that when you look at the blue bars are long-term English learners, and the proportion of them that are classified in a special education category. So you can see that on average, this is the average over here, 30% of long-term English learners, those are English learners after the 5th grade, who've been in the system for more than 6 years, are also classified in a special education category. And this is 3 times the average of English-only students, which are the red bars. So this is clearly an important group of students that we need to think about. And I think this raises 2 fundamental questions, this high proportion of long-term English learners that are also classified in SPED. First, it raises the question of how students with disabilities how some students with disabilities can cross the thresholds required of them in order to be reclassified. And this begs the question then, do these students who are remaining English learners and are also classified in special ed, do they continue to need the services, the language supports, et cetera, that they're given as English learners? Or are they languishing in that category because they're unable to reach the thresholds for reclassification? And if the latter is true, then do we need to think about alternative criteria for reclassification for students who are also classified in some special education categories? The second question that this brings up is the question of whether we're able to accurately identify special education needs within students who are acquiring English. So are we able to separate out the learning needs that we see that are due to disabilities versus the learning needs that we see that are just have to do with second language acquisition? And are we, there's been a lot of research that shows disproportionality in special education identification of English learners. And this disproportionality can sometimes take the form of overrepresentation, can sometimes take the form of underrepresentation. It depends on the special education category. It depends on the grade level. So there's some evidence that even timing of special education identification is different for English learners than for non-English learners. I think this raises a bunch of important questions. Yeah, we can ask questions. I want to hold off most of the questions until afterwards. But particularly if there's something I'm saying that's like not clear, or if I glossed over something that doesn't make sense, then definitely. Is it?
Well, I was just wondering what the green bars.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And then I also just had a question of students, either long-term or English learners who are identified as with special needs. Are they identified because they have a learning disability, or what kind of needs?
Right. So to answer your first question, the green bar, so the blue bar is our long-term English learners, the red bars are our English-only students, and the green bars are other language minority students who are not long-term English learners. So it includes current English learners who aren't long-term, so they're in elementary school. It includes IFEP students who are initially fluent English proficient, and it includes RFEP students who have been reclassified. And this particular, we have looked at distinct special education categories, but this particular graph lumps all of them together. And so this is a student, this shows the proportion of students with any exceptionality, identified in any exceptionality category. And if you look at the brief later, you'll see we go into a little bit more detail about the specific exceptionality categories that tend to be more likely, higher prominence for English learner students. Yes.
And this is relative to this slide. Just on Sanger, did you take into consideration, Sanger has made incredible efforts at RTI, and so I just wondered if you looked at whether that played a role in their numbers in comparison with everyone else's.
Right. So this is work that was done by Karen Thompson in the ELL Leadership Network, and I know she's worked quite closely with Sanger, but I don't know the specific answer to that question. Okay, so that was some of our findings with regard to the diversity of English learners. The second area of focus of our research findings has to do with English learners' access to core content in school. So this was really an area where there was a lot of convergence in our research. And what we were finding across districts is that, in general, English learners tend to take more lower track classes than non-English learners. And in addition, they're more likely to be excluded entirely from certain core academic subject areas. And I would say, just stepping back from that for a second, that in general, what we found, certainly in the project that I was involved with, and I think across projects, we found that there tends to be a lot of focus and accountability placed on providing English learners with access to English language support services and English language development services. But the other right of English learners, as laid out by law, is their right to be to have equitable access to core content and to be at grade level in terms of their academic performance. Or at least the opportunity to be at grade level in terms of their academic performance. And we found that there was less focus on this other side of English learners' needs. So there's the language needs and the content needs, and we found much more emphasis on the language needs than on the content needs. So I'm going to show you a couple of figures from one district on this. So here I'm circling the statistics that have to do with the level of class, so remedial, grade level, and honors. And what you can see is that there's modest overrepresentation of English learners in the grade level and remedial classes, and underrepresentation in the honors classes, as well as slight underrepresentation in terms of taking algebra by the 8th grade. Actually, research that came out of the ELL Leadership Network found much more acute issues with regard to math enrollment, but this is a different district. So the ones that have the percentage are percentages. This is the average number of credits taken per semester in middle school. Sorry, thank you for reminding me to go over my tables carefully. In this district, a course is a 5-credit course. So this basically, this is number of classes. This is actually number of classes. So on average, an EL is enrolled in 2.42 grade level classes, but only 0.14 honors classes, whereas an EO on average in middle school is enrolled in half of an honors class per semester. Now we're going to go over to percentages. Yes, so for instance, this finding out of the ELL Leadership Network found that 5% of English learners are enrolled in an accelerated math sequence that goes Algebra 1, 8th grade, Geometry, 9th grade, Algebra 2, 10th grade, whereas 25% of English-only students are enrolled in that accelerated sequence. And were those RFEPs? The 25%, which the ELs are just ELs. The 25%, I think the 25% relates to all non-ELs. Yeah, so IFEPs, RFEPs, and EOs. So yeah, we did do some looking in different districts. We looked at high school course taking as well as middle school course taking, and this is a pattern you see across levels and across districts. So, yeah, that's fine. Okay, so next let's look at this subject area enrollment. So this is what I was talking about in terms of being excluded entirely from certain core subject areas. And this is where I find, at least in this district, the most striking results. So basically what this says is that 30% of English learners are not enrolled in English language arts in any given semester in middle school, compared to 2% of English-only students. So that's the most dramatic in terms of a single subject area. But even in math, English learners are twice as likely to not be enrolled. And in science, English learners are 4 times as likely not to be enrolled. And then this is the real kicker, I think, which is that this is the proportion of students who are not enrolled in a full course load. And by full course load in this definition, we're meaning science, math, and ELA. And you can see that over a third of English learners in any given semester are not in a full course load, compared to 4% of English-only students. So I think this is a big finding. This whole issue of English learners' access to core content is a big finding in these studies.
And excuse me, so this is middle school, this is one district, and the ELs that we're looking at here, you're looking at them whether or not they are long-term English learners or if they just recently arrived.
This district doesn't have a ton of newcomer students. It's mostly LTELs. But yes, this is including all English learners. And I'll talk about, actually right now in just a second, some causal research regarding this. But first I just want to say that, those are two trends in terms of access to content. But there's also a third trend which has to do with weak or inappropriate instruction. And Peggy can talk about this more in the Q&A, as a bunch of this research is coming out of her project, which is that English learner students are oftentimes enrolled in sheltered classes. And teachers report that sheltered classes, not always, but oftentimes offer a slower paced curriculum, a less rigorous curriculum, and are more likely to provide alternative curricula and not the mainstream curricula. And finally, related to this, a little bit different, is this issue of linguistic isolation, which is that we definitely see a pattern in which English learners tend to be clustered into classes where they have less access to English fluent students. And because of that, they have less access to authentic, meaningful, and abundant discourse, academic discourse in English. And finally, this point, which I think is an important one, is that so what I showed you a second ago in terms of that table, that was just pure pure numbers, right? But we've done some research that looks at what is the actual effect of being classified as an English learner on your access to core content. And we're only able to do this for a certain group of students that come into the district with relatively high English proficiency levels. But what we see is that some of these patterns that we see, particularly with regard to exclusion from core content areas, is actually a direct effect of having been classified as an English learner. Okay, so we'll move on to the reclassification findings. And this was a relatively large focus of all of the projects. So there's a lot of different findings that came out of this. So I'm going to spend a few different slides on it. This first finding is about variation in timing to reclassification. So this is, a big deal. There's a lot of accountability that's wrapped up into how quickly students are advancing in terms of English proficiency, how quickly they're attaining English proficiency and being reclassified out of EL status. And also in California, we have all this issue with that if students are not reclassified by the end of 5th grade, they're typically then classified as a long-term English learner. So it's an important, it has gotten a lot of attention as an important outcome for students. However, when you look at reclassification rates, they vary widely by district. So for instance, within the ELL leadership network, it ranges from a low of 24% of English learners reclassifying by the end of 5th grade to a high of 65% of English learners reclassifying by the end of 6th grade. And the range is even wider when you take into account the larger districts that we looked at as well. So what accounts for these really large differences in reclassification rates by the end of 5th grade? Well, the first thing, and what we sort of think of, I think, automatically, is differences in student background, and that certainly is true. In particular, students' level of English proficiency when they come in is really important in terms of predicting timing to reclassification. But in addition to that, and this is what I talked about earlier on, has to do with their level of literacy and academic language skills in their home language. So students who have higher academic literacy, academic language skills, and literacy skills in their home language tend to reclassify more quickly. Second, this is quite important, is that the criteria for reclassification in California vary by district. So it is much harder to be reclassified in some districts than it is to be reclassified in other districts. And the variation encompasses both the inclusion of specific criteria, so specific district level assessments or grades or things like that, and we'll look at this in a second. But it also deals with the level that is set, the threshold that's set for reclassification on those various criteria. So I'll show you an example of this. This is a bunch of our districts that we looked at, excluding the anonymous district. You can see here, for instance, on the CST, so all of the districts, California sets this up as a regulation, have to include the CELT and had to include the CELT and the CST. Both of those are being replaced. But you can see the criteria on the CST ranges from 300 to 350, which is a grade level difference, a pretty large difference. CELT subscale criteria, cut scores range from 3 to 4, so early advanced to advanced. Is that what that? I think that's the name. Early, advanced, intermediate. What is it? Intermediate and advanced. Okay, early advanced. Okay, right. Thank you very much. And also here, this other, and it's broken down in more detail in your policy brief, but whether districts are including district level assessments, and some of these districts include multiple district level assessments. So there's wide variation in the criteria that the districts are setting for reclassification. And going back to this list again, one of the other things that happens then, particularly because of these multiple criteria that students have to meet, is that there's some complications just in terms of the logistics, that you get your CST score at this time, you get your CELT score at this time, you get your grades at this time, and it's this very complicated matrix of trying to figure out, this is research coming out of Peggy's project, that it gets very complicated to try to figure out when a student is or is not eligible for reclassification. And typically districts say you have to meet all of these things at the exact same time. So if you've got 5 out of 6, but you missed the 6th one, you've got to start all over again the whole next year. So one of the effects of this, and Karen Thompson has looked at this, one of the effects of this is that you end up with students who remain classified as English learners who really are proficient in English, who are quite high performing academically, but are missing one criteria a year or 2 criteria a year or something like that. Another reason for the variation in timing to reclassification has to do with how adherent districts are to their own criteria. So here we found variation in terms of whether a district does this with paper and pencil, or whether it's automated, whether it's handled centrally, or whether it's handled at the school level. These kinds of things really impact whether students who are eligible for reclassification are in fact reclassified or not. And in one district, what we find is that, and this plays into the sort of human role in this, in one district we find that in elementary school, fewer students are reclassified than are eligible. And we can talk about some of the incentives that may be driving that. Whereas more students are reclassified than are eligible once you get into middle and high school. So the relationship switches. And finally, another thing that impacts variation in timing to reclassification has to do with instruction. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about bilingual and dual immersion programs, but just to sort of foreshadow that, bilingual and dual immersion programs are focused on instruction in the primary language in the early grades. And so what this ends up meaning is that students take a little bit longer to acquire English proficiency. So this also does impact timing to reclassification. Okay, so next, in terms of reclassification, we looked at barriers to reclassification. So what are the criteria that students are more likely to be missing and to block their ability to be reclassified? And in general, what we found, and this actually echoes research that has happened outside of California and outside of our research, is that in elementary school, the CELT is the primary barrier to reclassification, or English language proficiency, whereas at the secondary level, it's those academic criteria that are more likely to be the barrier to reclassification. And this is actually has some really important implications to think about, because basically what the situation that ensues then is that by the time students finish elementary school, most of them are considered proficient in English by the way that we measure it. But they're remaining English learners because of their inability to pass these academic criteria that English-only students are not held to, only English learners are held to. So that's a complication. And in addition to that, as we saw with the findings in terms of access to content, I think this plays into it, that we're holding students responsible for their academic outcomes when we're also seeing that we're not necessarily providing them with equal opportunity to have that academic exposure. And finally, we also looked at the impact of reclassification. So given that the timing to reclassification varies so widely, and given that English learner status is structuring the kind of services and exposure you have to language services and academic content, it's important to think about what's the effect of reclassifying students on their academic performance and also on their opportunities to learn in school. And what we found here is that it seems to depend. It does look like certainly reclassification is consequential for students, so it does generate effects for them. But what these effects are not totally stable. So for instance, and this was outside of our research, but Karen Thompson and Joe Robinson-Simpian found that in LA, in a project aside from this project, found that in LA, at a time when reclassification thresholds were set relatively low, that reclassification could actually have a negative impact on students at the cusp. particularly on their graduation rates. Because basically the idea there is that the thought was that they were taking away English support services from students that still continued to need those services. On the other hand, research that came out of Peggy's project and my project shows almost the reverse, which is that reclassification increases your opportunity to learn in school by providing you additional access to core content classes in particular. So in LA, Peggy finds that reclassification generates more enrollment in core content area classes and earning more credits in those classes. And in the project that I worked on, you find a real jump in the percentage of students who are enrolled in a full course load once they're reclassified. Okay, so now moving on to the bilingual and dual language programs. So as all of you know, most English learners in California are in English immersion programs, in large part because of Prop 227 that was passed in 1998. And this is true in our partnership districts as well, with the exception of the one big anonymous district that I talked about earlier. In that district, there are these 4 instructional programs that have been in place for a long time and a lot of students enroll in. Early exit bilingual, maintenance bilingual, dual immersion, and then also an English immersion program. And so we really were able to track longitudinally how students perform in those 4 programs. And just to foreshadow what we find, we really find that bilingual and dual language confer a medium-term advantage to students. And we see this advantage in academics, academic growth. We see it in in acquiring English language proficiency, and we see it in reclassification. So I'm going to show you I'm 2 of those outcomes: English proficiency here and reclassification. And this is the proportion. In this case, we're looking at Latino ELs. The proportion of Latino EL students who are either reaching English proficiency or being reclassified by the program that they're in. So I hope you can see that graph, those graphs. But basically what these graphs are showing you is that in general, there's an early advantage in the English immersion program. So, and it's not necessarily very big, but there's an early advantage in the English immersion program where more students are acquiring English proficiency and being reclassified in those early grades. However, by the time you get to 5th grade, that relationship in general is reversing. So more students in the 2 language programs are reaching English proficiency and are being reclassified if you're in a 2 language program. And I know this dual doesn't look so great here, but in our research on academic growth, the academic growth rates of students, depending on the programs you're in, dual really shines in those graphs. You really see that. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that data from the same anonymous district?
Yes, it is. Yeah. This data is all from one district, but certainly we are not the only people to have looked at the effects of bilingual education. There's a very rich literature on this, and these findings complement that literature. In general, that's what the literature finds. Yeah.
I wonder if you just explain what maintenance bilingual means?
Sure. Yeah. So maintenance bilingual in this district is a bilingual program that goes at least to the 5th grade and can go into middle and high school, depending on what schools you enroll in after elementary. Early exit ends at 3rd grade typically in this district, and then the dual immersion program also enrolls English learners, but also enrolls students whose primary language is English and exposes them with the goal of having them both learn both languages. Thanks for that question. So the final area of findings relates to teacher preparation for English learner instruction. This was not a major focus of our projects, but in all of our projects we included either surveys with teachers or interviews with teachers, and so this was this emerged as findings in the various projects. And basically what we found is that teachers feel insufficiently prepared to teach their English learner students, particularly in the context of the Common Core. They feel a need to shift their practice to support their students. For instance, doing things like more extended writing opportunities, more multi-step problems, more open-ended questions. And they also talked about the struggle to teach all of the curriculum and cover all of the standards. And this struggle oftentimes ended up in a tension between coverage and mastery for students. So teaching for coverage versus teaching for mastery in classrooms. And teachers finally talked about a real need for support and professional development, in particular to support their English learners in light of the Common Core. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the policy implications, and we can certainly talk more about those research findings and the policy implications in a little bit in the question and answers. So we basically broke down into 3 overarching recommendations, or 3 areas of recommendations. The first has to do with how we in California classify students learning English, classify and reclassify students learning English. And we found that EL classification is too blunt, too variable, and too likely to produce unintended consequences. So these are some ideas we have for how to improve the classification and reclassification system. First, we encourage California to consider a common definition for English learners. This would mean that English learners would have the same, more similar characteristics across districts. And importantly, it would mean that districts could share knowledge better because they would be dealing with similar issues with their English learners across districts. So we think there should be the consideration of common criteria. And in thinking about that common criteria, we encourage California to think about using only English language proficiency. So getting rid of all the other criteria for reclassification, including the academic criteria for reclassification. I know this is maybe a little controversial for some of you. Let me see what I want to say about that. So this is already in place in several states, like New York and Washington and some other states. And what we think is that as we talked about earlier, at the secondary level, a lot of English learners are remaining English learners because they're not meeting those academic criteria. So by using only English proficiency level, English proficiency as the criteria for reclassification, we would do a better job at ensuring that students who are remaining English learners were, or students were exiting English learner status when they no longer needed the English language supports. It also would mean that we would not be punishing students for their lack of access to exposure to academic content. And we encourage the state to consider setting that English language proficiency criteria at a level that parallels the smarter balanced assessment distribution. So that's a little bit complicated, but basically what we want to do is we want to find the cut point on the English proficiency test where English proficiency is no longer impacting students' ability to perform academically. And this is a way of doing that, and it's been put forward by Robert Linquanti and Gary Cook, and I think David Francis has also talked about it. So those are good people to look for in thinking about that. So the second recommendation has to do with improving how California collects and uses data on students learning English. The first recommendation here is that we conduct more longitudinal analysis of English learners. And that's because, as we saw, for instance, in looking at the effects by linguistic instructional program, that you can actually have quite misleading results if you look just at the short term. And we think it's important to consider the short term, but also consider the medium and long term, particularly when you're thinking about students who are acquiring another language. That takes time. Related to this is that it's really important, and this is certainly gaining traction in California and at the federal level, it's really important to track every English learners. And by that, I mean not just students who are currently English learners, but students who have been reclassified. Because again, if you only look at current English learners, you're skimming the top off every year, and you're getting very misleading results about how English learners are performing. So in order to get a fuller picture, you need to look at how students who enter the district as English learners perform, regardless of what happens to them as they move through school. That's not to say that we shouldn't look at subgroups. It's not to say that we shouldn't look at long-term English learners. We shouldn't look at newcomer students. We shouldn't look at current ELs. It's just to say that when we're trying to get the big picture of how English learners are doing, we need to track all ever English learners. Next, support districts in monitoring academic and linguistic progress of English learners. So we think that districts should be setting goals, academic and language goals for their English learners and monitoring those. And that the state can play an important role in supporting this. And finally, in this group of recommendations, we think the state can incentivize research practice partnerships such as these research partnerships that I'm describing today. And finally, this is the last slide, and this is the most important slide, I think in some ways, or certainly the most important set of recommendations. It has to do with expanding the educational opportunities of students who are learning English. So the state can play a really important role in ensuring that English learners have full and equitable access to core content. So we can do that by setting regulations, by monitoring how districts are accomplishing those, and by holding districts accountable to make sure that their English learners are enrolled in core content area classes. We do this pretty well in terms of English language development, but we're not doing a very good job in terms of access to core content. Second, remove legal barriers and create incentives for bilingual and dual immersion programs, so sort of a reversal of course here. But as we saw, and as much research across the country shows and internationally, bilingual instruction and dual language instruction supports students academically, it supports them linguistically, and it supports them in terms of crossing these thresholds like reclassification. Expand access to high quality English learner teachers, or teachers that have English learners in their classrooms, which is basically all teachers at this point. But this also includes bilingual teachers, which California is uniquely positioned to have a wonderful supply of bilingual teachers, and yet we have a shortage. So this is something that the state can create incentives and have some good role in trying to have strong initial teacher preparation, recruiting bilingual teachers, and also strong professional development for teachers. And finally, support capacity to correctly identify these dual classified students, these students who are English learners and also classified in a special education exceptionality category. And this requires having assessments that aren't biased against English learners, that are accurately able to pick up the learning disability, any learning disabilities in English learner students. And it also means having trained, capable people on these IEP teams and assessors who are able to separate out these different kinds of learning needs and make sure that we're identifying students in a timely way for special education and identifying them accurately. So that is the presentation. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. As I said, it's a lot of projects with a lot of research, so I know that's pretty dense. But you do have the policy brief, so you can go back and look for any more details. And Peggy, I don't know if you want to come up now and we can take questions.
If you are interested in high school course taking, I brought I brought some of my data, so I wouldn't lie.
Great.
Anyway, did you want to know about? Okay. Well, we actually did what you asked about, which was to break it down by language status. So in middle school and in high school, but I'll just tell you about the high school. Could you speak up, please? Oh, sure. So how about I come over here? Is that better? Okay. Sorry. We actually looked at course taking and course credit earning at both middle school and high school. And we broke it down by language status. So we looked at long-term ELs, ELs, students who had just reclassified the prior year, students who had reclassified 2 or more years before prior, IFEPs and ELs. So to make this long story short, I'll tell you that the bottom line is that the long-term ELs, followed by the ELs, earned the least number of 36 units for IPEPs per year. Now, we did this for a whole year, so on average, if you're on course, you're actually earning 50 credits. Now, what we did in this particular analysis is we looked at credit earning with a C or higher, because that's what the UCs require. But basically, the pattern looks the same whether we put a, sort of a stipulation of did you earn a particular grade, or we just look at the average credits earned. It looks exactly the same. So when you look at the total number of credits, these students are earning nowhere near what it will take to graduate. Not even to just graduate. So,
Yeah.
I think that answers your question? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe in the green and then in the pink.
You might not have the answer to this, but I'm really curious about the new LPAC, and I think what makes a lot of practitioners nervous about this notion of going with only an ELP criterion is SELT currently is not a real good predictor of academic success. There's
Right.
not a relationship
Right.
between SELT results and CST or
Right.
anything else. And so you talked briefly about LPAC being more aligned to us back to Common Core.
Right.
Is there some work, to identify whether it is a good predictor of success, or is that part of the thinking, or do you even know?
That's an important question, and I imagine that people are working on that. I probably know just as much as you do, which is that the LPAC is supposed to do that much better. It's supposed to be aligned with Common Core and with the academic language you need to succeed in content area and in for academic performance. But I do not yet know, and I'll ask Peggy if she does, of any studies that have looked at that to see does that look like it's playing out in terms of results.
Well,
Well, there's piloting, right? So
The board is going to be adopting blueprints at our November meeting to discuss that alignment. And so that's one of the items that we will be discussing. And yes, the LPAC will be piloted in December.
great,
right.
So
Well,
we don't have
the o-
information on any of
Yeah.
that quite yet.
right,
The one thing I would say, I think that there's been a lot more work as, the LPAC has been developed for a number of groups to actually think about looking at the Common Core and what are the kinds of language skills, academic and literacy language skills in the different content areas for the Common Core that would be needed for a second language learner. So we're hopeful. And I think one of the recommendations is, in fact, to see, yes, does it predict other kinds of outcomes, which is one of the reasons we're saying if in fact you can find that point at which there's a cut score that predicts similar performance to
Right.
non-ELs, then that would be a good place to do it. And hopefully there will be a lot more articulation. We hear this all the time when we're out in the schools from teachers that the SELT, they didn't feel like it was even related to the ELD standards. So
right. Yeah. Did you still want to ask a question?
No,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
When you talk about having just English language proficiency as the main criteria for
Yeah.
classification,
Yeah.
did you look at what supports were made available in those partnerships for FEP students? Because that's a concern that English learners are supposed to be learning both English and be acquiring academic content.
Right. Right.
And so once they become classified as fluent English proficient,
Right.
then they transition over, but they may not necessarily receive the supports that they need to continue to build upon their academic content. So that's a very big concern about just having, at least from my perspective, English language proficiency as the only criteria. If there aren't any resources to support the fluent English proficient students once they get to mainstream.
Right.
So did you take a look at that, at students and resources provided within those partnerships?
We looked at, one of the things we looked at is academic performance of reclassified students, of FEP students who reclassify at different points in time. This isn't exactly answering your question, but I have a couple thoughts about it. So we definitely found a pattern where those students who are reclassifying later have very different performance trajectories than students who are reclassifying earlier. So students who are reclassifying later tend to not perform as well academically than those who are reclassifying earlier.
But you didn't
Sure.
look at the resources. I mean, you didn't look to see if those
FEP students
the
are-
FEP students were given additional ELD support. Were they, you know?
I think that's quite district specific. I think districts and schools. Do you want to talk about LA?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's not only district specific, I think it's really school specific, and it can
yeah.
even be classroom specific.
Yeah.
Because in part, we're not tracking those students. And so one of the reasons that we think it's very important to in fact have this EverL group, because what that would mean is we would be looking at how ELs are performing, but we would continue to look at how these reclassified students are performing, and we would know whether or not they were in fact continuing to advance, which then might allow us to shine the light on those students and say, we actually need to be providing them the kind of instruction that will make them successful at learning the core content. And at the same time, once they meet that LTEL status, when they enter secondary level, meaning middle and high school, that we're not limiting their access to the core content and the full curriculum, and actually, frankly, non-EL peers, which we've done a lot of work on that side of it. So we know that that's what's happening to them at that secondary level. So in a sense, it would allow us sort of these different policies, recommendations would actually allow us to shine the light on the entire group. Both the parts that are progressing and are doing quite well, so you can see the full range of these students, both their needs and their successes.
I just wanted to clarify, when you talk about mainstreaming the kids or the bilingual kids and the kids who are dual enrolled, whether or not there's the social aspect of not academic language but street language, playing soccer with kids, doing the kinds of things where if you're only hanging out with your other English language learners, you're twice as resistant to talking to somebody who is a native speaker, because you feel like you are unable to communicate what you want, when the desire to communicate will motivate you if you're put in a situation where you have to actually talk to this kid. And so the social aspect of getting that aspect of English, it's not related to what you read in books and what homework assignments you get, but it's the motivating factor that's going to get you over the hump.
Right. It has to do with, we talked a little bit about English learners' linguistic isolation, being isolated with other English learners.
Yeah, but it's not just academic.
It's not just academically. And I was just on a panel last week with, probably many of you know, Patricia Gandara, and this is a main point that she talks about, is trying to get every student involved in extracurricular activities at school and every student involved in those social experiences that are not just in the classroom, because she thinks that's really key to having that authentic engagement and friendships with students who are proficient in English, et cetera. Yeah.
What teachers tell us is that when students are isolated in sheltered classes that are either all EL or this is sheltered core content courses at middle and high school, when they're all together all of the time and they say traveling together all day, that they report that those students also end up not participating in like one teacher said, like, football's really big here, basketball's really big here. She mentioned a number of extracurriculars, and she said it's really sad because these students don't actually participate in them. And it's because they're always together. And she said, I think it would be much better if they were integrated into classrooms instead and didn't have that, while meeting their needs for specific, subjects and so on, also integrating them throughout the day. So.
There was a study done in Canada, in the French-speaking part of Canada, about bilingual education. And the remark of the observer. This was not somebody who was summarizing a lot of research. This was observance. And she said the speed at which kids from French speaking homes picked up English was dramatically improved if you put them out to play with English speakers as native English speakers, having nothing to do with what's on the academic program. Because they want to communicate.
Of course, yeah.
And the numbers were really quite handsome.
Great. Other questions or
I just have a
thoughts?
clarification.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the diversity of English learners,
Yeah.
you talked about that there wasn't an assessment or a way to determine the proficiency of that student's native language.
Yeah, some districts use L1 assessments, but many do not. So it really that's another case where there's a lot of just variation by district whether or not they're assessing, and also there are some assessments that are language neutral, but other cases where there's Spanish language assessments, or it depends also on the language background of the student.
So once they were identified as English learner, they didn't do a follow-up to see how proficient they were in their home language.
Right. Oftentimes that does not happen. Yeah. Yeah, but what we're finding is that having that understanding of the kind of literacy or pre-literacy base or academic skills is really helpful in terms of thinking about the kinds of services that student needs.
I think in this case, wasn't it, they did it initially, right when they did the self, they also did the other, the L1 assessment. And that was what I think Karen used in that study. Because it was in LA. And
Right.
they used to have
Right.
it,
Right.
and they dropped it because they said there's no reason
Right.
to do it.
Right.
We said, wait, there is.
Right.
It'll help you know
Right.
who may need more help.
Right. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
You didn't mention this, and I wondered if in any of these projects, if they included input or feedback from parents and students. Because all the things you talk about regarding isolation, failure to assess, the impacts of isolation, of not getting enough credits, not getting access to core curriculum, are things that we have been advocating as advocates for years. And we have student
Student voices.
student voices telling us that.
Yeah.
So to the extent you can, it would be really important to include the voices, because even your research is going to be hard for us to use to get policymakers to change their policies.
Without the stories that
Yes.
accompany it.
It's just research. But I mean, even the research from Humro on the exit exam, they told us that students that had access to geometry by 9th grade were going to pass the test in 10th grade. And they also told us from the beginning that there were these amazing gaps of achievement for English learners and non-English learners. Oh, duh. And we just kept doing it, and we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on that test and remediation, both at K-12 and community college. It's astonishing. What do we have to do? So please, I want you to do more of this research because it's so important. But you have to through the voices of families. Thank you.
Well, you are quite right.
Yeah.
And we did ask. We could not do everything. So we couldn't observe classrooms. We couldn't talk to parents. We couldn't talk to teachers. We did talk to teachers. We couldn't talk to students. However, we did ask this question, which you're getting at, which is, to what extent are parents and students aware that they're English learners and the consequences it has? Do they know the reclassification criteria, the process, and the consequences it has for curricular placement? We did ask those questions multiple years in our study. And the answer is essentially, middle school administrators and teachers were telling us that students would enroll and be ELs and not know that they were ELs until at that point. And then they were quite dismayed and shocked, but that really, in terms of really understanding the criteria, the process, and sort of the consequences of either remaining in EL or not, the answer was that no, there wasn't a whole lot of awareness on the part of students and not much involvement on part of parents. That being said, there are some schools in which there is an attempt to really begin to at least inform students at that middle and high school level about where they are, where they need to get, and what the consequences are. So there's some, I can say there is some positive movement in that direction, but it would be nice if it was more formalized and there was more support and resources to do that as well.
In other words, giving the student their own sort of autonomy to advocate for themselves because they actually know that they're classified as English learners. A concept. Thank you.
Some schools are doing
Yeah, over here and then over there.
I just had a question about your first recommendation on reclassification.
Yeah.
You were just talking about reclassification, or were you talking about identification?
Well, initial identification is already just based on proficiency, English proficiency.
Right. Did you look at all about how it's applied locally?
Yes. Like adherence to policy, it tends to be higher for initial classification, but there are some ways in which you can't even measure it. Because, for instance, one of the things that you hear from families is that they're gaming the system to a certain extent, right? If they know that by checking this box that their student's gonna likely to be classified as an English learner, then they're not gonna check the box that they speak Spanish at home. Or in some districts, the reverse happens because there's so much competition to get into dual language schools, particularly among the English-speaking students, that families will mark the box that they speak a language other than English at home, even when they really don't. So there's a certain amount of gaming of the system, but in terms of adherence to the CELT cut scores, at least in the district that I worked in, it's about 85% adherence. So it's higher than, at least for reclassification, adherence to reclassification policies.
The only thing I would add to that, Ilana, is that we also, I think, there's some concern about over-identification. And we certainly heard that because the child and the parent come to school, and the question is understood as, does anybody in your home speak another language? And there could be like a grandmother or great-grandmother or something who does in fact only speak Spanish, but the rest of the family is not necessarily using that as the primary language at home, and that student will be identified as an EL if they don't pass the. So there's some issues, and studies have been done on problems with that.
Yeah, the Department of Ed has done a study that probably many of you have seen that gave the CELT to English-only students. And a huge number of them failed to pass the CELT. Yeah. Go ahead.
Also, I think the department is they're undergoing a study, right? They're going to have a new home language survey trying to address all of these. Yeah.
Great. Great. That's great. Okay, let's go here and then.
Another question that I guess kind of relates to whether students know their EL, because looking at the course taking table that you have.
Yeah.
So EL students are taking fewer core classes. They're actually taking more classes overall.
Yeah.
So do they think that they're in an English class and they're not in any, like what do they think they're taking in those? Are they taking what looks like an EL class and are they not aware that it's specifically for EL students?
So the reason why you see that pattern, that's a good thing to note. This is again going to differ by district, but in this particular district that data is from, students are not in remedial classes instead of grade level classes. They're in remedial classes and grade level classes if they need remediation. And so that boosts the number of overall credits that they take. And also, obviously, if you're including ELD as credits, if you're just looking at credits overall, then EL students tend to take more credits overall because of their ELD classes. But I don't know the answer to your question about do students think that they're in English language arts classes. That again would be, we'd have to talk with students specifically about that.
And the way you classify this, if they're taking a remedial English class, that would not, you're not counting that as a core content class with the chart?
Yes, yes. So remedial does count as a core content area class. If it's a remedial math class, it counts as a math class. So when it says there that 30% of kids are not in ELA, they are not in any ELA.
Not any at all.
Nothing, no ELA. Yeah.
So did you look at district policies?
Hang on, let me just get to you and then.
Yeah, so I wanted to get back to that percentage of students, high percentage of students that are English learners and also identified as special ed.
Yeah.
Because those students, they have to have an IEP, and they would have to have the parent and student involved in discussing their IEP. So that, to me, doesn't, I can't seem to, I don't know what that means. Like, why is it that so many of them are not aware that they're not English learners? If they have an IEP and they're identified as that, you know what I mean?
You're saying about what Peggy said about not I'll let you answer that.
I'm having a hard time understanding or correlating those concepts.
Well, these were staff reports, and in general, I don't think they were thinking about their special ed students. And it would also depend on when the special ed was, when they got the IEP, right? It could be that it's been ongoing for a long time. So we don't really have data to address that specifically.
Well, and just to point out a couple other things. I mean, Martha just alluded to the fact that we are working on a home language survey, and hopefully we can, share some of those results in the near future.
Great.
With respect to the board's work around, well, we did an adoption on the ELA, ELD framework that was adopted by the board, and we're slated to bring to the board this next month an adoption for instructional materials. So this will begin to address some of the issues that you're talking about.
Right.
And this will be, frankly, we're going to be, a trendsetter, if you will, California, in bringing those two areas together so
Right.
that teachers actually have materials to address English learners as they are presenting the core ELA materials. So it's not going to be necessarily a pull-out or anything like that. They can begin to address those jointly.
Jointly, right.
So that's something that,
Yeah.
resources are on their way, so to speak. We've also, the department has done some work, and it was presented to us in July regarding the linkage back to the math as well as the science framework work. So those, in the past, they have been isolated, but I think that we're now looking at how do we bring these things together and to provide the resources to the teachers
Right.
in the classroom, so as they're presenting the core subject areas, they also have some specific vignettes or strategies for English learners.
That's great. Yeah.
So, it's true, you're presenting on data that is in the past. We're moving forward. The LPAC won't be operational until, for a couple more years, several years. But, we're working on all of these things.
Right,
But I think
right.
that your research is very helpful for us to begin thinking.
Could I just say one thing? I think that's great news for the kinds of stuff that you're talking about, and the fact that you're trying to adopt curricula that will in fact address ELD within the content areas. I think from what we hear from teachers, we spend a lot of time interviewing teachers every year in this project, and even when they get the materials, they really need help to figure out how to use them, how to actually implement them. So I'm not saying that your office is in charge of like figuring it all out, but all I'm saying is I think that's the very first step, which is really critical. But they will say, well, they gave us this, but they didn't really give us any professional development, and I don't know how to use it, or I tried it, it didn't work with my students, I don't know what to do, so they're going back to like whatever they are used to using. Right. So that's all I would say. It's just like if we can really put that teacher support in.
Time for one more question.
I want to really applaud your focus on identifying, the identification of English learners and special ed, because that's the key. But the second part, and I don't know if you've looked at this yet, is, okay, so if you have an English learner who is also receiving special education, our experience has been that oftentimes their status as an English learner kind of gets put to the wayside and focuses on the disabilities and addressing the disabilities. And there's a huge need for those teachers to understand how to support their second language acquisition within the context of the IEP and general instruction.
That's a
I'm thinking universal, it's all gonna be better.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Okay, I want to thank Ilana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Strada, for working on the report and for backing up on the Q&A here. And I want to thank you all for coming. And I
Yeah,
certainly
thank you
would
for
encourage you
coming.